Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to be talking about the Portlet Lifecycle. So let's go ahead and get started. In the Portlet Lifecycle, there are 6 main phases or 6 big phases that a portlet may or may not go through depending on which phase we're talking about. Let's start off with the most important. This is going to be the init phase. In the init phase, this is when the portlet initializes or gets itself kind of quote unquote installed. So when a portlet is first deployed into Liferay and in turn the portlet container, this is when this phase is going to kick off. As the init phase is initiated, this is when any initial parameters that need to be set by the portlet are going to be set. Any sort of connections that are going to be made will be made during this phase. And this is only ran once during the portlet lifecycle, during deployment. With each one of these portlet phases, there's going to be a corresponding method that goes with it. So for the init phase, it's going to be the init method. The next phase that we're going to be talking about is the render phase. This is one of the most important phases that we're going to be discussing. What happens during the render phase is when a portlet is placed on a page within the Liferay world and the portlet needs to display itself, the render phase is going to be called. During the render phase, technically what's going on is the HTML fragment that's going to be used to display the portlet on the page is being generated. If we see a portlet on the page, this is a very strong indication that the portlet has gone through the render phase in one point in time. The render phase is going to have a render request and a render response object. We can have parameters and objects within that render request and render response objects that can be passed between the JSP and on the Java side so that we can do some nifty things with that. Just like the init phase has the init method, the render phase has the render method that goes along with it. Now, there's a couple different ways in which we can call the render phase. The init phase is called for us. We don't need to worry about it. So there's a couple different ways, but the one that's the most important to us is over on the JSP sides. We have these things called render URLs. So the render URL is what we can use to invoke the render phase. We take these render URLs and we can bind them to something like a link or a button. And once that link or button is clicked, then the render phase is invoked by the user. Within the render URL, we can also have specific parameters that will be placed within the render request object. We can then pull those parameters from the render request object in the render method, and then we can do some programmatic things to it. So we have this render URL with this var called view entry URL. We find where that is. That's here in the anchor tag. So when we click on the anchor tag, the render URL in turn is going to be invoked. One thing that's very unique with our portlet phases is that it generates a specific URL in our URL bar. So in this example, or here is one example of a URL that's generated once we click on that render URL link, or in this case, that anchor tag. So once the render URL is invoked, it then calls the render method. So this is one example here of the render method within a portlet class. So we can, in this situation, pull that specific parameter that was set within the JSP. We can do something to that parameter or to that object, whatever it might be, and then go from there. One thing that makes the render phase unique is the way that it works with every other portlet. So in this example, let's say we're making a render request to portlet A. So that render request is sent to the portlet container. The portlet container will tell portlet A to render, and then we get the HTML fragment back. Let's say portlet A affects the data that's being pulled from portlet B and portlet C. What then ends up happening is the other portlets that are on the page will also re-render as well, or refresh effectively. So in this example, something could happen to portlet A that causes it to render. The other portlets on the page will then re-render or render as well. So the next phase that we're going to be talking about is the action phase. The action phase is the second phase that we as developers are very concerned about, are very interested in when it comes to developing our applications. Now, the action phase, just like the render phase, is typically invoked using a URL. So in the previous example, we saw a portlet URL. With the action phase, we will have an action URL. So what we can do with this action URL is bind it to something like a button on a form or maybe a link on a form. And then from there, we can perform some sort of action. Using the action phase, this will also allow us to trigger events. We'll talk about that a little bit later. One thing that is defined within the Java standard is that after the action phase is finished, the render phase then follows. So action and then render always occurs. Just like with the render phase, there's also an action request and an action response object that we can have parameters passed to and then extract them out. The method in the Java standard that the action phase corresponds to is the process action method. Let's take a look and see how this works. So on the JSP side, we've created a form using Alloy UI. With the form, when it detects a specific action, it's going to call or invoke that edit entry URL. That edit entry URL is tied to that action URL that's right above it. So action is performed on the form, something like a save or a submit, and then that action URL is invoked, thus calling the process action method or invoking the action phase within our portlet. And you can see a generated URL here, kind of lengthy, but all of the parameters that are relevant to what's going on with the action phase is within that URL. So over on the process action method, right, you can see that we're extracting some of the parameters that are coming from the action request object. We have an entry ID and a title, right? We can extract those. We can do something with them now that they're expressed as a long and a string, and then go from there. After the action phase is completed, the render phase is then kicked off. So let's take a look and see how this flows. So let's take the same example of a form being submitted. The form is submitted, thus invoking the action phase with portlet A. The process action method is called. Let's assume whatever takes place occurs, and then the render method is then called right after the action phase. So with the render phase, as we discussed previously, each one of the portlets on the page will then go through the render phase again to be able to update anything if anything needs to be updated. So action phase and then the render phase is invoked for all of the other portlets on the page. The event phase. The event phase is one of the ways in which portlets are able to communicate with one another. We call that IPC for short. So the way that the event phase works is we have one portlet who's going to be responsible for sending an event object. We have any number of portlets then configured to quote unquote listen for the object. So if a specific event object is sent and portlet B is the one configured to listen for it, once that object is sent, it will then retrieve the event object, and then we can do whatever it is that we want to that event object. So since we are using the action phase to send the event, right, we just discussed how after the action phase, the render phase follows. This is true also with the event phase. So in the diagram here on the right-hand side, action phase, event phase, and then the render phase. The method that corresponds with the event phase is the process event method. So if we're using our OSGI knowledge to help us out, we have a component here at the top. We have two properties that are relevant for this example, the portlet that's being registered, and then the second property is saying that we are going to be publishing or sending out an event. From there, we'll use that process action method to create the event object and then set the event here on the action response object. Once the event is sent, then any portlet that's configured to hear or receive that event object will then receive it and then go from there. When we're receiving an event using our OSGI pattern, once again, we have the component annotation. The first line is specifying which portlet am I listening for, and with that, what type of event am I listening for? So I'm listening for a specific event coming from a specific portlet. From there, using the process event annotation, we can then say I am going to be receiving this event, and then we can do whatever it is that we want with the event object that we are receiving. So again, bringing this full picture Portlet A is the one sending the event, so we'll use the action method to do so. Portlet B is the one receiving the event, so using the process event method or annotation as we saw in the OSGI world. Right, once we receive the event, we then will have each one of our portlets re-render, since after the action phase, the render phase is going to follow. The last big phase that we're going to be talking about is the resource serving phase. So one of the big questions that always comes up is, do we always have to re-render after the action phase? Yes, and if so, is there a way around it? And so the resource serving phase is a way that we can do just that, dynamically serve a specific resource to a portlet, and that will then in turn circumvent the render phase. So this is typically done by using AJAX requests. So this does not trigger the render phase. We can dynamically get resources served to a specific portlet if that's what we want to do. We have a couple of different use cases here. Again, a lot of them revolve around not having to refresh the page, not having to re-render our portlets. So here is one example of using that serve resource within the JSP side. Again, you're going to want to take note of that resource URL up at the very top. It's done a little bit differently than what we do in the Java standard, but this is going to be the pattern. Within the portlet, we have the method that goes with it. In this case, we're going to be creating a JSON object that's then going to be used in order to display the specific contents that we want to dynamically serve. And then finally, the last phase is the destroy phase. The destroy phase is analogous to uninstalling a portlet. So this phase is called when the portlet is being undeployed, right? So the destroy phase will then clean up anything that needs to be cleaned up and leave, everything nice and tidy. Following the pattern with the destroy phase, the destroy method is what's going to be called. So very good. So there's a lot more to cover. This wraps it up for our portlet life cycles, and I will see you in the next video.